Welcome back to Boom and Bust. My guest today is Eric Lombardi. He is the founder and president of More Neighbours Toronto, talking about some of the challenges for younger Canadians in our society today. One of the things you mentioned in some of your writings is how this situation with housing for young Canadians matches up with the rather dismal findings of the World Happiness Report. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah. So to paint a picture, in I believe it was 2015, but it might have been 2013, Canada ranked fifth on the global happiness rankings. In 2023, Canada's ranking slipped down to 15th. But when you broke it down based on age, Canadians over 60 reported being the eighth happiest globally. Young Canadians reported being 55th happiest globally. And this is the greatest divide of all countries surveyed in the happiness report, the disparity between how young people are feeling and how older Canadians are feeling about their lives and their futures. And what was notable, particularly for Canada, is globally, young people overall report higher levels of happiness than those over 60, but not in Canada. And so young Canadians are experiencing what I like to call the milestone recession, in which public policy through various facets, whether it's the credential requirements to enter a profession in the workforce, whether it is white collar professional or even many blue collar professions now have very lengthy processes to get educated. So we're entering the workforce later, right? Starting salaries when you enter the workforce are lower adjusted for inflation today than they were in the vast majority of decades in the late 1900s, so 1960 through to 1990. And then the cost of housing has exploded to an extent. So not only are you starting a career later, not only is it taking you longer to get financially sustainable, but the barrier to securing a place that you're comfortable to start raising a family has become later. And we're seeing the results of this in even things like our fertility rate. It's just not viable to have the living standards and the domestic dreams that were once attainable to previous generations anymore.
Yeah, so I'd like to unpack that because you have mentioned education, student debt, credential inflation. These are key factors for young people being held back. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's correct. And all this is part of what I like to say is the delay in the achievement of milestones that were once typical markers of, call it, becoming an adult. And all those things are sliding backwards. And I think, it's hard for young people to communicate what this means. But I think when you look at, rising mental health issues, depression, declining fertility, declining rates of marriage, we're seeing all of these issues sort of culminate in, I think, a warning sign that I think a lot of older Canadians have dismissed for many years, but are starting to reconcile that, this is their children and this is their lives. And, what level of happiness will they have? And, what does this past generation owe to the future?
You raise a good point, though, because sometimes when there's intergenerational conflict, there's a complete lack of understanding, let's say, of older generations of what is befalling the younger generation. But in this case, it sounds like there is starting to be a realization that there's a very real problem. Older generations realizing that it's not really working out for their kids and grandkids. Is that what you're documenting as well?
Yeah, I do think the Canadian public has gone from a state of, if young people worked a little bit harder, if they were a little bit tighter on, the spending on luxuries, then they could have these things, to the situation is actually quite different. And this is a real social problem. And,
Right.
That's why when I talk about, boomers and this idea of a generational war, I'm not talking about individuals. I'm talking about how a generation over a long period of time has voted for public policies that work for them, but not always considered the downstream effects of those on future generations. And we're now at a point where we really need to reconcile that in, I think, a fairly substantial and, I think, difficult way.
It seems the case. And I do want to get into some of the other public policy issues that flow from that. We're going to take a brief break with our guests, though. I have a few commercials for you to consider, and we'll be back with Eric Lombardi from More Neighbours Toronto after the break. Please stay with us.